tasked to do a presentation on Milton Glaser, and although I'm very happy to do it, he's been called the godfather of modern design. So it's a huge undertaking to do in 8 slides. He's very prolific, thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of artwork. He's very intellectual. I actually like this guy, and I can relate to him a lot. And maybe if I remember as we go through the presentation, I can tell you some of the things that I find myself similar with him. One being that he's an illustrator. He's very intellectual, and over the course of decades, and even now, he was born in 1929, he's still alive. In June, he'll be 89. And they still put microphones in front of him and ask him, hey, what do you think about art now, or a million years ago, or 20 years ago? He's the kind of guy who could break it all down for you and just make you think whether he's right or whether he's right or wrong. So in a moment, I'm going to go ahead and just tell you a little bit about him, and then we'll show you some of his work. So if you haven't figured out by now, he's the guy who did I Heart New York. So in homage to him, I designed a flag for him, and I put all the states in alphabetical order with I Heart, and then I did a little I Heart New York. Yes, first slide, next slide. So he was born in New York. He was born in the Bronx, Hungarian parents, and he's Jewish, and he went to high school. He speaks a lot about education and the importance of education. And he went to a really good high school, and he went back years later because they invited him, and he redesigned their in fact, he made them change their name of the high school because it fit his graphic better. Oh. It's a graphic, anyway, it's a very interesting story. So then he went to Cooper Union, which is a very, very prestigious art school. He went on a Fulbright scholarship, and when he got out of that, he's like 23 or something. He's got a full head of hair and a mustache, I think, and I'm going to Europe. And he thought he knew everything. These are his words. He thought he knew everything about art and what it all meant. And he landed in this place called the Accademia delle Belle Arti di Bologna, under this guy here, the Giorgio Morandi. And I've had a lot of fine arts classes, and this guy was a fine arts teacher. It was all about art. So Mr. Glaser, when he got done and he graduated there, he would tell friends that he then knew that he didn't know a thing. Like, he literally didn't know that. He said that they realized that art is in history, art is in things, and you can either incorporate all of that into art or not. And he'd quote of this guy named Horace back in the Greek time, the old mythology, the Plato, and well, it wasn't mythology, but back in the Greek time, with real people. And there was a guy named Horace who used to say, there is no art, there's only artists. And the way that Mr. Glaser would discern what he would discern from that is that art is it's in the paradigm, it's in the period, it is of what's going on now. So it could be different 10 years from now, what you're thinking. Again, very intellectual, and I'm going to try not to put you to sleep, but I think that's how he would want to be represented in this speech today. So he came back to America, and he was working with a guy, and they were in he came back, and he developed this place called Pushpin Studios back in the 50s with Shawaka, or whatever that guy's name is. Just upended, turned graphic design on their heads. The one dude he was doing it with said, hey, we were like the Beatles. And I don't know, I've read biographies on the Beatles, and the Beatles kind of really changed the world from everything, what we were wearing or our hairstyle, to what we were singing, and just the way we were looking at life. Apparently, Glaser and his friends in Pushpin Studios, they were doing that. And they were very intellectual, and they were anti the way it's supposed to be done. And that's the art that they did, and just blew people away. And And then, so he's the kind of guy that when it became like, oh, hey, that's a Pushpin Studios piece of art, he got out. He said, hey, once it became a style, then that's not me anymore. And so, but anyway, so in the 70s in New York, it was pretty bad. Poverty, unemployment. President Ford was the president at the time. And there's a lot of crime. And so the board of tourism decided they wanted to get a program to get more people to come to New York. So they employed the agency he was working at. It's called WGMB or whatever, it doesn't matter. And they said, hey, we got a slogan. The slogan is, I love New York. What can you do? So they put together this thing with like 2 throat lozenges or something, and they wrote it and they sent it, and the client said, great, let's do it. And so here's a little story where I can relate to him. He said, so like the next day he's in a cab. It's like Paula Scher saying she was in a cab. Remember when we watched that film? He goes, oh, he's got pieces of paper. And he pulls out a piece of paper and he's like, wait a minute, I got it. And that piece of paper that he drew on is now in the Museum of Modern Art. And he's all and he drew the heart, and then he drew New York. Calls his boss when he gets home. I got it. And that boss says, no way. We just got this other thing approved. And he says, you got to come take a look at it. So he came over to his house. He says, okay. And then they rushed in. And the next is history. This thing is the most, this piece of graphic is the most reused and reinvented graphic in the history of graphics. That, like, you can't get off a plane in Rio or Switzerland or Germany or any of these places that the other presentations around the world where you go in the airport and goes, I heart Germany, I heart Rio, or whatever. I text my niece, I heart you. It's like, it's...
and there's Memphis as well, I heart Memphis.
Yes, I'm sure. It's
Tony Malone did.
It's everywhere. Makes the city of New York millions of dollars in licensing fees, and he doesn't get a cent. He says he didn't make any money, but he actually got like $2,000 initially when they did it. It makes a gazillion million dollars every year, and they actually have a lawyer team in New York that's what they do 365. They go to work every day and they go, okay, we're going to send out cease and desist to places in the world and say, stop using our logo. And nowadays, you know, he's in his 80s. I think when he was like in his 70s, he had someone interviewed him. He says, you know what, it's just freakish, and I'm kind of actually tired of it, that I'm known for that because I've done so many more things, as we'll see. I think it's a fascinating story, and yeah, he was just fishboning. So after he did the studios, then he got hooked up with the New York magazine. It was going in the tank, and they had a Sunday supplement that he took over with another lady. It was actually the other lady's gig, and they hired him. And they produced every 7 days. They had to produce articles, and he loved food. His mom was a horrible cook when he was young, so he ended up just loving food. So many pieces of his artwork has food in it or food connotations. So he would start doing the food reviews for the New York magazine, and he says, I won't take credit for it, but if you want to give me credit for it, I'll take it. He's the dude at lunchtime. He'd walk out of his office, and it's still there. He goes to his office every day, and there's a school right next door with little kids. They play at noontime. They come up, make noise, and he hears them out the window and just doing his thing. And he'll walk down in all these dives that have really good food. So he used to write articles about dive restaurants that had really good food, and it became like, oh, hey, that's kind of cool. Now it was like a thing to do. He says he won't take credit for it, but he said he had a strong, every 7 days or whatever he would review. And there's documentaries of him walking down the restaurant and going and getting dim sum. It's really cool. So that kept him busy, and from that, there just magazines from around the world started calling, and he'd get on a plane. This is how I relate to him too, is that always doing just more than one thing at a time. I enjoy doing that as well. And he would just be on a plane and just go to some magazine in Jerusalem or whatever and say, okay, this you want my help, and he has a huge background in magazines, book covers. Through this whole time, he was a teacher, and he kind of weird sometimes when people come and say, well, why do you want to be a teacher? And he said, after a while, I just really don't like being asked that, because he said that the way that Americans look at teachers, he's all, teaching is where it's at. And his best buddy, the guy who's worked with him through all this stuff, said that he's a great teacher, and the thing about him is that he could take something and actually explain it. And he said, if you were a student and you did it right, it's all good. He goes, but if you're a student and you did it wrong, he said, his friend said, it was almost even better, because then he'd sit down with you and he'd just, show you the real thing. So he's been an educator all of his life, and again, very intellectual. And I always think about this when I think about teaching as well, is that it's like if you stop learning, then it's just stopped. And so he has a motto, it's written down somewhere, so I'm just going to paraphrase. It's literally just the best teachers are the ones who keep learning. Then he went into supermarkets and restaurants. He actually, back in the 70s, there's a food chain supermarket up and down the East Coast that, like in modern day supermarkets, when you go in and say, do this, or the line is here, whatever, they model it after all the stuff that he did for this food chain. Like he literally just spent like 10 years designing a supermarkets and restaurants. He did the Windows of the World, which is on the top of the World Trade Center, and when the terrorists came, and like he did all the cloth napkins, and he actually designed a lot of restaurants. Some of them I looked at, it was really kind of weird and very kind of fine art kind of thing. Some were actually kind of cool, like he incorporated some lightings with these guys riding bicycles with he did a lot of different restaurants. But he did the Windows of the World, which is like a very 4-star restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center, and terrorists took it out and it bombed, right? And the guys who were going down in the wreckage, over the months and years, and collecting just anything they can, and put in the museum, they found one of the napkins from the Windows of the World, and it had the logo on it, and that's where they knew it was Windows of the World, but he's the one who designed it. So it's not like, it's just kind of, oof, like wow, and so now that thing is in the memorial, not because it's Milton Glaser, but because of it's like, hey, something survived. Anyway, just an interesting story. And then he got all of that, and then he made his design, and that's his company, and he's been going ever since. Next slide, please. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, my fault. So he became super famous. This is very important. So he took Bob Dylan. Oh, another thing that he does is he has no problem, the word might be stealing, like taking someone else's art and stealing an idea from it, as long as you do it right. So he was at the Met one time. He saw this guy named Marcel Duchamp. I won't tell you about him right now, but if you want to, you can come visit me in the next week or so. I can tell you all about why this guy is famous. He did, I don't know if anybody knows who Bob Dylan is, but he's a famous poet, and his son's actually, nowadays, is a singer-songwriter. Bob Dylan was a big thing in the 60s. So all the hippie, the groovy, that kind of thing. He's a singer. And Milton Glaser made this poster, and I guess it just sent people crazy in liking it, and it was the beginning of psychedelia. So he was in the whole movement. If you ever see like hippies and groove and the Yellow Submarine, all that kind of stuff, those kind of posters, he was in the whole movement as well. Okay, next slide, sorry. So this is just a bunch of his work. If you push click, just click. So he did a lot of things. He was in front of he designed the Juilliard.
Oh, no. Sorry, I thought you were going to keep clicking.
No, sorry. He did the Juilliard. I love this poster. These are just examples. Just to kind of get a feel for what he's done, has done. I love this poster with how he makes the movement out of the color of this silhouette of a Napoleon on a horse. This is totally 70s. This is Milton Glaser. Like that's him. He's an illustrator. If you read like what he will sit there and come and talk to you about art, and he'll say like illustration is dead. It's actually kind of sad. And the world right now, and he's still working in this world, it's all about art directors, and they're the ones who are getting all the credit. And the counterpoint to that is, well, hey, when Rockwell and some of those guys were famous illustrators back in the early 1900s, nobody knew who their art director was then. Again, I know this is all very intellectual, but it means something. He's saying that his art is dead, and it's the computers that are taking over. Anyway, in the 80s, he did the Sesame Place. That lasted for a while. He did DC Comics. They had their logo for many years, and then in the 80s he did that, and that's lasted for like 20, 25 years, and they have a new one now, whatever it is. Lincoln Center. This is a very famous film that don't suggest watching. It's a really weird black and white film. This is one of my favorites. He did a Coke 7-Up ad and says, "Don't be left out in the cold," and you probably can't see from where you're at, but it's raining Coke, and everyone's all hiding in the house of the 7-Up. Very whimsical, very intellectual way of looking at things. Next slide, please. He did a lot of typography. Since he was an illustrator, a lot of his stuff would just be drawn and boom, that was it. It wouldn't, okay, well, let's click on Helvetica or let's click on whatever. He just made it for whatever poster. He did go ahead and make some typefaces that are famous, and then he said he had this idea for a long time, and then he finally made it into one, and he uses it in his own logo. Next slide, please. Here's some quotes from him. So after 9/11, they went back to him and said, "Well, hey, look, you know, we're hurting. The world's hurting. They just, you know, the world treated." So he took his "I Heart New York," and he said, "I heart New York more than ever," and the posters for free. And then he put a little fire or smoke from the Twin Towers up there. So that was pretty crazy. And then he, big time in the Cooperstown, whatever that is, the chamber.